The story begins in the shadowed corridors of power and fear, where one man ruled both the underworld and the streets above it. A mafia boss whose name alone sent shivers through those who dared to whisper it. His wealth was immeasurable, his influence stretched from politicians to police, and his word was law. Yet for all the control he commanded, there was one place where his power meant nothing: inside the sterile walls of a hospital room, where his only son lay dying. The boy, barely 13, had been struck by a mysterious illness that baffled every expert who tried to treat him. It started with fatigue and faint spells, but soon his body began to shut down, one organ at a time, leaving doctors speechless and the father desperate. For a man used to getting anything he wanted with a phone call or a threat, helplessness was a foreign emotion that tore at his soul. He spared no expense. The most renowned specialists from around the world were flown in: cardiologists, neurologists, immunologists, each one bringing their instruments, their charts, their confidence. One after another, they examined the boy, reviewed scans, ran tests, and left, shaking their heads. The mafia boss watched them with growing rage and despair, the tight grip of control slipping through his fingers. He had bribed governments, silenced judges, and buried rivals, but none of that could save his son. For the first time in his life, his money was worthless. His authority had no meaning against the invisible enemy, eating away at his child's life. The boy's once lively eyes had dulled to a lifeless gray, his skin pale, his voice barely a whisper, as he asked his father if he was going to die. The boss couldn't answer. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital became a fortress of failure. The mafia's men stood guard outside, doctors scurried through the halls, afraid to report more bad news, and the boss sat beside the boy's bed, his tailored suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Every new doctor who arrived gave him a spark of hope that died just as quickly. One proposed an experimental surgery. It failed. Another suggested a rare virus. The tests came back negative. The illness had no name, no pattern, no cure. It was as if the boy's body had turned against itself, and all science could do was watch rumors spread quickly. Some said it was a curse, revenge from those the mafia boss had wronged. Others whispered it was divine punishment. The boss himself began to wonder if it was true. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now he was learning that death was the one force no man could bargain with. He prayed to gods he had long ignored, offered donations to churches, made promises to saints he never believed in, all in vain. The sound of machines monitoring his son's failing heartbeat became the rhythm of his torment. Each beep was a reminder that time was slipping away despite the hundreds of doctors he summoned. There was no improvement. Some stayed for days, others for hours, but all left defeated. One by one, they told him there was nothing more they could do. His money could not buy what did not exist, a cure for something unknown. The mafia boss's rage turned volcanic. He smashed tables, tore medical reports, screamed at staff, threatened doctors. His men watched in silence, knowing better than to intervene. Behind all the fury, though, was fear. He wasn't angry at the doctors, he was angry at his own powerlessness. For the first time, he had no weapon to fight with. The hospital itself seemed haunted by the boy's suffering. Nurses moved quietly, avoiding the mafia boss's gaze. Some even resigned, unable to handle the pressure of his presence. His mansion remained dark and empty, his criminal empire temporarily forgotten as he devoted himself to watching his son breathe. Uncertain if each one would be the last, he began to realize how fragile everything he had built was. His empire, his power, his reputation, all meaningless compared to the small, fragile body that lay motionless before him. He would have traded every dollar, every property, every ounce of influence, just to see his son open his eyes and smile. Again then came the 100th doctor. The mafia boss had lost count of how many had entered and left those doors, but this one seemed to symbolize the end. A world-renowned medical genius from Switzerland arrived, studied the case for 2 days, and finally confessed that the illness was beyond human understanding. Sometimes, he said quietly, there are things that medicine cannot explain. The mafia boss dismissed him with a look that could kill, but inside, his heart broke completely. He felt like a king stripped of his crown, a warrior without a sword. He sat in silence beside his son's bed, the machines humming softly, the boys breathing shallow. It was a sight that burned into his memory more deeply than any crime or act of violence he had ever committed in that silent hospital room. Surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and despair, he realized that all the doctors, with their degrees and accolades, were powerless before nature's cruel mystery. Their knowledge, though vast, had limits. They spoke in technical terms, their voices void of hope, hiding behind the comfort of science that could not save a child. The mafia boss stared at them and thought of the irony that 100 of the most educated men and women alive could not do what his love and desperation cried out for. He began to understand that not all miracles wear white coats or come from sterile laboratories. Something deeper, something purer, would be needed to reach his son. As the final doctor left, the mafia boss found himself alone again with the boy. The weight of failure hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the city he once ruled continued without him, its chaos muted by his absence. Inside, the man who had once been feared by thousands sat helpless, holding his son's cold hand, wishing for a miracle that no science could deliver. The empire of the underworld had fallen silent because its king was watching his heart slowly fade away. Powerless against a battle no army could win. She lived in the same city but in a world completely opposite to his. While the Mafia boss sat in marble halls surrounded by men with guns and power, she scrubbed the floors of those same halls late at night, her hands raw from chemicals and her back aching from long hours. Her mother was a cleaning lady who worked tirelessly to feed her only daughter, a quiet, observant girl named Amara. They lived in a small apartment with cracked walls and flickering lights, but it was filled with warmth and love. Amara had always been different from other children. While her classmates memorized lessons, she wanted to understand them. She would take apart broken radios, study patterns in light, and read discarded science books she found in the trash. Her teachers saw something rare in her, a mind that was not just sharp but endlessly curious. Yet poverty kept her brilliance hidden from the world. Her mother, exhausted from double shifts, often told her that intelligence was a luxury for the rich. "People like us survive, not succeed," she would whisper. But Amara didn't accept that. Every night, after her mother fell asleep, she sat by the small window with a candle and studied medical journals she downloaded on an old phone. She didn't have access to a laboratory or formal training, but she had something few others did: a relentless mind and a heart that believed knowledge could heal. She became fascinated by biology, particularly rare diseases. There was something about the human body's mysteries that called to her. She believed that every sickness had a secret and every cure a story waiting to be uncovered. One evening, while waiting for a mother at the hospital where she cleaned, Amara overheard two doctors talking in despair about a boy they couldn't save. They mentioned a mafia boss, a mysterious illness, and the failure of more than 100 specialists. Most people would have ignored it, but curiosity lit a fire in Amara's mind. She quietly followed her mother into the ward that night when the cleaning crew was sent to mop the floors. Outside the boy's room, through the small window in the door, she saw him, a pale child hooked to machines, his chest rising weakly with each breath. Beside him sat a man whose face was worn with pain and pride. Even from a distance, she could feel the heaviness in the room. It wasn't just a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of helplessness that no medicine seemed to touch. The doctors left the room later that night. She lingered outside, pretending to wipe the floor while listening to their conversation. They spoke of blood tests that showed abnormal enzymes, of cells behaving in ways they'd never seen before. They used words she had read about in textbooks: autoimmune, genetic mutation, metabolic collapse. Something about their description didn't sit right with her. She thought of a research article she had once read about a similar condition caused by exposure to a rare toxin that could mimic genetic disorders. It wasn't something any doctor would normally test for because it was so rare, and most labs didn't even carry the equipment to detect it. But she had an idea. It was risky, even foolish, but she couldn't ignore it. For days, she secretly observed. Each time her mother went to clean another floor, Amara lingered near the lab, watching technicians discard test samples. She collected one small vial marked with the boy's name, hidden among waste materials, and took it home. There, using a makeshift setup of old chemistry tools she'd salvaged from her school's junk pile, she began her analysis. It took her 3 nights without sleep. Her tiny room became a miniature lab, with notes covering the walls and formulas scribbled on scraps of paper. She used her instinct and memory to replicate tests she had only ever read about. Finally, under the dim light of her desk lamp, she noticed something strange: the presence of a synthetic compound not naturally found in the human body. It was the toxin she had remembered from that obscure research paper. Somehow, it had entered the boy's bloodstream and was slowly destroying his cells, confusing the doctors into thinking it was a disease. Her heart raced. She realized that if she was right, then the cure wasn't about complex surgeries or rare drugs, it was about neutralizing the toxin before it caused irreversible damage. She ran to the hospital the next morning, clutching her notes in the sample. But no one would listen. The doctors brushed her off, security told her to leave, and even her mother scolded her for interfering in things she didn't understand. Yet she refused to give up. That night, she waited until her mother's shift ended and then slipped into the boy's room unseen. The machines beeped softly around him, and the mafia boss was asleep in the chair beside the bed. Amara stood there, trembling but determined, holding the small vial of serum she had created from her researcher neutralizing agent made from a mix of natural compounds. It wasn't an official medicine, but every instinct told her it would work. She hesitated only for a moment before taking action. Gently, she administered the serum through the foreline. Then she waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The boy's heart monitor began to stabilize. His breathing deepened, and a faint color returned to his cheeks. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she watched the impossible happen. The mafia boss woke up in confusion, seeing his son stir for the first time in weeks. He looked at Amara, this young girl in a janitor's uniform, and demanded to know what she had done. She explained everything in a trembling voice: how she'd studied his son's case, how she found the toxin, how she created the antidote. At first, he didn't believe her. But when the doctors rushed in and confirmed the boy's sudden improvement, disbelief turned into awe. The next few days were a miracle unfolding before everyone's eyes. The boy grew stronger. The machines began to disappear one by one, and the doctors who had failed stood speechless as they watched a recovery they couldn't explain. The Mafia boss demanded that the girl be brought before him again. When she stood before him, nervous and humble, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time: purity. He asked her who had taught her such knowledge, and she said quietly, "No one. I just wanted to help." That answer struck him harder than any bullet could. A child from the lowest part of society had done what all the power and money in the world could not. She had saved his son, not with wealth or connections, but with compassion and genius that expected nothing in return. News spread quickly within the hospital, though few believed the full story. To the Mafia boss, however, it didn't matter who believed. He knew the truth. He saw it with his own eyes, the miracle that came not from science alone, but from the mind and heart of a girl society had ignored. In her, he saw both the fragility and strength of humanity. The beauty. The Mafia boss had spent his entire life building an empire from fear. His name had been enough to silence enemies, his wealth enough to control anyone he desired. But now, as he stood beside his son's hospital bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the world looked different. The boy was alive against every prediction, every doctor's diagnosis, every medical report filled with hopelessness, and the person responsible was not one of the hundreds of professionals he had paid millions to. It was a young girl in worn shoes and a faded uniform, the daughter of a cleaning lady who had spent her life mopping floors others dirty. The realization struck him like lightning. The girl's act had not just saved his son, it had shattered everything he believed about power, worth, and humanity. He couldn't stop thinking about that night, the trembling courage in her voice as she explained her theory, the quiet certainty in her eyes when she said she just wanted to help. No demands, no negotiation, no expectation of reward. It was so foreign to him, a man who had spent decades in a world where every favor came with a price. Her compassion disarmed him more effectively than any weapon could. For years, he had lived surrounded by men who would kill or die for his approval. Yet it was this girl, poor, overlooked, untrained, who had done the one thing all of them could not. He found himself questioning everything he had stood for. What good was power if it couldn't save the one person he loved? Most when the doctors confirmed that his son's recovery was real, he called for Amara and her mother to come to his office. The same place where deals were made, threats delivered, and orders of death spoken in hushed tones now felt transformed. The girl entered nervously, holding her mother's hand, both dressed in their cleaning uniforms. He saw the fear in their eyes, the kind born from living in a world where the rich and powerful always dictated the terms. But he didn't speak like the man he used to be. His voice was softer, almost uncertain. When he asked Amara to sit, she refused at first, out of respect, but he insisted. Her mother trembled beside her, afraid of what he might say, until he simply whispered, "You saved my son. I owe you everything." Those words, from a man like him, were heavier than gold. He offered her money, stacks of it, enough to change her life forever. But she shook her head. She didn't do it for wealth, she said. She just wanted people like her mother to have a chance, to be seen, to be treated as more than invisible workers. He looked at her, stunned. No one had ever turned down his money before. In his world, loyalty was always bought. Gratitude always came with a price. Yet this girl had no greed in her, only an earnest light that made him feel something he hadn't felt in decades: humility. For the first time in his life, he bowed his head to someone weaker than him. That moment changed him. He began visiting his son, not as a boss, but as a father. He sat by the boy's side and told him stories about the girl who saved him, about her courage and intelligence. The boy, still recovering, listened with fascination, asking to meet her again. When Amara returned to visit, the boy smiled for the first time since his illness began. They talked about science, about how she had discovered the cure, and he promised that one day, he'd help her build a real laboratory. The Mafia boss watched them, feeling something shift inside his chest. He realized that the empire he had built on fear was worth nothing compared to the purity of that moment-to-moment of genuine kindness. Untouched by corruption, days turned into weeks, and as his son grew stronger, the boss withdrew from his criminal operations. His men noticed the change. He stopped giving violent orders, stopped attending meetings that decided the fates of rivals. Instead, he began funding hospitals, donating anonymously to clinics in poor neighborhoods, and establishing scholarships for underprivileged students interested in science. One of those scholarships, of course, bore Amara's name. When asked why he was doing it, he simply said, "Because I met someone who reminded me what it means to be human." His closest associates didn't understand it. Some thought he had gone soft, others feared he was losing his mind. But he didn't care. The fire that once fueled his ruthlessness now burned with purpose. Samara's life changed too, though not in the way people expected. She accepted a scholarship arranged by the Mafia boss, not as a favor, but as a chance to pursue her dreams properly. She wanted to study medicine and biochemistry so she could help others the way she had helped his son. Whenever she visited the hospital, she was welcomed not as a cleaning lady's daughter, but as the girl who had accomplished what the world's best minds couldn't. The staff whispered her story, sometimes embellishing it, but the core remained true. A girl with no resources had cured an incurable boy. The Mafia boss made sure her mother never had to work again. He bought them a house, not as payment, but as a gift of respect. It was his way of saying thank you for showing him the power of kindness, but beneath all the changes, there remained a quiet connection between the two families, a bond that transcended class and history. The Mafia boss often visited Amara's mother, not as an employer, but as a friend. He would sit in her small kitchen, drinking tea from simple cups, listening to stories of her hard life. Each story humbled him further, peeling away the layers of arrogance that had defined his existence. He saw in her eyes the same strength he had once admired in men of violence, but hers came from endurance, not cruelty. He realized that true power didn't lie in domination or fear, it lived in resilience, love, and forgiveness. As months passed, people began to notice that the once feared Mafia boss had disappeared from the underworld's map. Rumors spread that he had retired, that he was dying, or that he had found religion. None of them were true. What had really happened was much simpler, and far more profound. He had found peace. The same man who had spent years destroying others now spent his time rebuilding lives. He visited schools, anonymously funding programs, ensuring that no other child with brilliance like Amaris would go unnoticed because of poverty. And every time he looked at his son healthy, laughing, alive, he silently thanked the girl who had made him see that humanity was far more powerful than fear. 2. Carried the memory of that day with her as she grew older. She'll never let it turn into pride. Instead, it became her purpose. She often thought about how strange fate was that the son of a criminal empire had been saved by the daughter of a cleaning woman. It was as if the universe had chosen her act to balance the scales of justice in its own mysterious way. And though their worlds could never fully merge, they were forever bound by the moment when compassion crossed the barrier between wealth and poverty, between power and humility, between sin and redemption. The Mafia boss's life became her proof that even the darkest hearts could change when touched by something pure, something human, something that didn't ask for anything in return.